Thank you, John. Thank you, Bob. I should have mentioned, by the way, the mission of the American Academy of Diplomacy, which is a small organization of our most senior former diplomats, is to strengthen American diplomacy and to help explain diplomacy to various audiences in the nation. That's part of why we're here. Well, in the 40 years that I've been dealing with this, Iran has moved from being one of the two pillars of stability in the Persian Gulf, something before most of you, many of you were born, to being enemy number one. So tonight, what I want to talk about is to put Iran into perspective in terms of how much threat, what kind, the multiplicity of our interests, and suggest that we think about our policy from our interests and not just our fears. There is an article, was an article in Foreign Affairs recently, in which the three authors suggested that America should orient virtually its entire policy around the containment of Iran, advocating, and I quote, "In private, U.S. diplomats should convey the message that the way the European countries react to amendments to the nuclear agreement will affect their relations with the United States," close quote. In other words, Iran is such a threat that we should be warping the texture of our relations with our major allies around how they conduct themselves toward Iran. And I would submit that that is excessive to the degree of threat. Now, Iran has held our people hostage. It has helped murder other people. It has backed terrorists. It calls regularly for the end of Israel, a state to whose defense we are pledged. And it has backed Hezbollah and the Assad regime in Syria. And it has contributed to sending arms into Bahrain and Yemen. So, you know, there is a record, there is a reason to be unhappy here. But I want to get this into perspective in three areas. One, where Iran has been a help, which we sometimes forget about, the size of the threat, and at least the possibility that many of its actions derive from fear as much as from aggression, a point that John was just explaining. So, remember, Iran did help us in the political settlement of Afghanistan, and it did continue to work with us in Afghanistan up until 2005, when I was ordered to break off talks with the Iranians about Afghanistan because all pressure was to be devoted to the nuclear agreement. I argued against that policy, but I lost. We share some interests, including defeating the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and in the not having a Taliban victory in Afghanistan. We have all kinds of other interests which diverge. That does not remove the fact that we have areas in which our interests overlap. And I think we ought to talk a little bit about what is the danger should Iran become a nuclear state. And for all the rhetoric, I personally would doubt that Iran would ever initiate a nuclear exchange with the U.S. or with Israel, simply because it would lead to the destruction of Iran as a nation and as an ideology. And if you look at their actions, they have in fact never risked the existence of the nation under the Islamic Republic. And so I think that is overdrawn. Now, if they were to have a nuclear weapon, I think using or misusing that as a shield for other action, they could produce a lot of trouble. And out of that, they might even manage to drag things into a war in the Gulf region. So I very much am opposed to Iran having nuclear weapons, but I think we need to understand the nature of that threat, which I think is not existential to the United States. My point in making this distinction is not to justify, but rather to point out that Iran uses terrorism as a tactic for broader purposes. And when we analyze the problem as only one of terrorism, then we lose sight of the motivations behind it. And in losing sight of motivation and of interest, we lose sight of the very things which have to be dealt with in order to change the policy. Now, all that said, Iran has not now or ever called for the destruction of the West or the overthrow of the governments as the Soviet Union did. It has not fielded an ideology like that of al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And so, I remember we dealt with the Soviets. So again, it is a problem. It is not an existential threat. The difference is important to constructing policy. So I would simply say we need to shape policy on the basis of our own interests and not our fears. And in doing so, it's useful to remember two other points. One is that our own approach for the last 20, 30 years has been muddled. It has been a muddle of contradictory messages. And given that we have an open society and very different points of view, we will probably stay muddled. But the point is, if our policy is based on Iran's actions, then would we be prepared for a friendly relationship with Iran if Iran changed its policies? Or is our policy one of regime change? Because if it's the former, we want actions changed, then there is at least the potential for understanding pressures, rewards to produce a change someday of Iranian policy. But if our policy is one of regime change, there's absolutely no reason for Iran to change its behavior, since any weakening simply is an advantage to its adversary. And it makes no sense. So when we have a muddled message, we have which is not the fault of any particular person, it's also part of our politics. But second, there is enormous suspicion after 30 years. Nobody can start a political discussion from a clean slate anymore, and that's too bad, but that's the way it is. In fact, we saw that very recently. We settled a legal case that we referred to the court as part of the hostage return agreement of 1979. And as a law-abiding country, we paid the settlement of that judgment. And that produced a firestorm of political criticism in the United States. Not quite sure where the basis is. We shouldn't pay our legal judgments when it's Iran. Anyway, it's a lightning rod. So whatever we believe about our policy, it's useful to understand, and this is a point John was making, that Iran believes we are duplicitous and that we regularly break our commitments. So we have the example that we find it logical that we would remove sanctions connected to the nuclear agreement and retain those connected to terrorism. And Iranians find it illogical that we remove sanctions on commerce and then prevent the commerce from occurring because our banking regulation becomes so complicated that the Iranian business can't figure out what to do and pulls back, even though perhaps they legally could act. And by the way, the Iranian message is equally obscure, with some Iranian leaders talking of improving relations and others talking of explicitly threatening violence in the Persian Gulf. So we have nothing to be ashamed of in the degree of our muddle. So let me briefly conclude talking about three questions that I think we really ought to talk about when we talk about Iran. What do we want from them? What must we protect from Iran? And what can we live with from Iran? And I would say, in what do we want, I would say, first, freedom of navigation and the free flow of oil, because that is essential to our economic health and that of the world. Second, that Iran not develop nuclear weapons. And third, that it cease supporting terrorist actions, including on the soil of our Arab Gulf friends, Israel and neutrals. Formulating our policy in this fashion would separate our opposition to terrorism from Iran's need for political allies. Fourth, it would be nice to have clarity about Iran's policies, but that's probably asking too much, just as clarity about ours might be a little much for us. There are other things we obviously want. We'd like more help in Syria in suppressing the Islamic State without having all the things they do that we don't like about Mr. Assad. We'd like them to get out of Yemen, although I think their presence is exaggerated. My point in those examples, and there are others, is that these are reasonable goals for the United States, and none of them rise to the level of critical interest. And it's useful to separate the things that are really critical to us, free flow of oil, nuclear issues, from those which are not critical to us. Under the label of what we must protect, I would include Israel and our Arab Peninsula friends. Israel needs no explanation, I think, but for the Arabs, I simply observe that we cannot get the cooperation we want in a whole variety of areas around the world if we are at the same time leaving them in doubt about our commitment to their security. The two things just don't go together. It is not, however, our task to get the Arabs to share the Gulf, as President Obama suggested. Our interests reside in finding peaceful ways to handle disputes. So, in setting forth these ideas, it follows that there will be areas in which our policies and Iran's will differ, perhaps seriously. Iran will not give up its alliance with a friendly Syria any more than Turkey will completely subordinate its opposition to certain Kurdish groups in order to work on defeating ISIS. Our challenge will be to find solutions that are just good enough for everybody in order to lay the groundwork for compromise. On the nuclear deal, we need to find a path that neither makes the agreement hostage to Iran, a situation where we have to constantly give up other interests to prove our goodwill, nor allows our pressures to jeopardize an agreement that has pushed the danger of a nuclear Iran arc for a decade. And we should expect them to test the limits of our resolve, as Bob suggested. None of this will be easy, and every decision will be controversial. These are really easy things to lay out in principle. They're really rough to do in practice. And we all, of course, spend our lives working on the practice. But, you know, and so there's the example. We need to on the one hand, we need to clarify our banking regulations so that business can determine what is allowed. And on the other hand, we need to maintain opposition, for example, to Iranian missile development that tests launches with slogans of death to Israel painted on the missiles. We need to be able to walk and chew gum. We should not expect, let me leave you with two last thoughts, one about clarity and one about expectation. We should not expect that the best policy will lead to change anytime soon. There is just too much history. There are too many suspicions. There are too many problems within each body politic to expect any policy can produce a rapid change. But this brings me to the second point, which is the need for a much clearer statement of what we are about, what we want, what the limits are to what we want, and what we are determined to maintain. And credibility, that is, that the message actually describes our policy intention, will come only over an extended time when our words and our actions reinforce each other. Only when policy goals are clearly and publicly consistent and maintained over a quite long period of time can any policy achieve credibility. And I think we're a little bit short of that now, but that's something to work on. And I think you're going to do whatever time we have for Q&A. And Alan, may I turn it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.